So now we're going to take our basic back and we're going to trace it just like we did to the front. And in tracing this, I'm going to use my ink curve. We're going to use it as a guide to help us create our back design. And again, you won't actually need all this of the pattern. You are just going to need certain portions, but like I said, just for the sake of training yourself of what a complete pattern looks like before you alter it, it's encouraged that you just go ahead and trace the entire thing out, even if you're only using certain portions of the pattern to achieve your design. And remember what we said from our history of sewing, history of fashion rather, that it's about precision. It might seem tedious and time consuming, but it's all about precision. The more time you spend with the garment or creating the garment, the more it's going to cost and the more you're going to appreciate it, because so much went into creating it. And maybe you'll appreciate a little bit more when you're going through and purchasing your clothing. You'll be like, I know all that went into, because although they have like basic patterns, like when you're talking about manufacturing, they have like standard patterns. Someone still has to do this. Someone still has to, even if it's computerized, someone still has to create this design and working pattern for somebody to work off of. So whether it's computerized or you're doing it manually, someone still has to create this. Okay, so now that we have this, we want to do the same thing that we did to the back. So we want to the front. So first I'm going to go down using that purple. I believe it was about 1 inch. And do that first line. And then I want to create, because this is the back, I want a bit of a curve, but not as much of a curve as you saw with the front. So I'm going to come down. Just under the armhole, so I'm going to come down about 8 5/8. And then I'm going to have these lines that connect. And as you can see, it's at a bit of a slant because I do want a little bit of a curve in my design in the back. So you might decide to just sort of go like this, like straight. So you can go straight across from just under the armhole, and then you go straight across here. That's definitely an option. That would be just a straight back. But for me, I'm dropping a little bit because I do want a little bit of a curve in my design. And I'm gonna redo that in a darker color because I think that's what I did to the front. I did it in a darker color so it was easier to see. Okay, remember seam allowance. So we're gonna do whatever you do to one side, you do to the other side. And even with your sewing, you have to make sure that if you decide that you're gonna give 5/8 seam allowance, that's how much seam allowance you need to give when sewing. Sometimes you get caught up sewing and you're like, some places is 5/8, some places are 1/2 inch, some places are 1 inch. That is going to affect the outcome of the garment if all the seam allowances aren't exactly as they should be. Okay, there it is. Sometimes I have to play around with my ruler until I get a comfortable. And I normally, to be honest, don't use this much seam allowance, but for the sake of the demonstration, because I want you guys to be comfortable until you get more familiar with everything, I want you guys to be comfortable using the 5/8. Normally, I'll only do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I do much smaller seam allowances, but standard patterns often come with that 5/8, and it's a good place to start because if you do make a mistake, at least you have a little bit of breathing room as far as like making a correction. But I normally just do the 1/2 inch. Now, as we build this pattern, whether you realize it or not, we actually built in a seam allowance for the center back. That way you can add in a zipper. So right in here, there's already about 5/8 worth of seam allowance. So you don't need to add any additional seam allowance, but you should also be aware that the back always needs to have the seam allowance, because unless you're doing a side zipper, that's where the zipper is going to be, and you're going to need that additional seam allowance because it's not going to be on the fold most of the time. So for the back, you're going to want to label it CB, and that will stand for center back, and that's just letting us know that this is not going to be cut on the fold, that this is going to be cut on the raw edge of the fabric. And I also didn't put that in the bodice, but you also want to make sure you create grain lines for yourself. And that's going to remind you what direction to lay out your pattern. So remember, we discussed in textiles that the grain line is sort of, it has much less give and it's very straight. That's what you always want to lay out your fabric on. You want to lay it on the straight grain. Unless the garment is a bias cut dress, which we are not making, that's the only reason you would lay it on the bias, if that's what you intended to create, a bias cut garment. But because you're not, you're going to lay it on the straight grain. So you just want to leave these marks here for yourself so you know that this needs to go in accordance with the straight grain. So I'm also going to sort of jump around here. So I'm going to also add cut 2, because remember, you're cutting 2 because it's not going to be on the fold. If it's on the fold, you cut 1 and then you open it and it's 1 piece. But you're cutting 2 pieces with the fabric together, but the raw edges are open. So you're going to cut 2 for interfacing and 2 for lining. And for the most part, it's just a repeat. So you're not having to make any alterations for the lining. In some garments, you do have to make alterations for the lining, especially if you have facings and those kinds of things. But for this dress, it's just a repeat of what you're using for the main fabric. I'm going to do those lines that tell me to fold my fabric over. And remember, you're folding towards the direction of the either center front or center back. So you're going to say fold. We have our seam allowance. You can even mark CA for seam allowance, so that way you know. Here I'm going to make my marks for, or my slashes or notches, and that's going to let me know that I'm going to be attaching the center back side seam to the center front side seam. Then you can also label side seam. So SS is side seam. And then SA is seam allowance. So do we have all our markings? So we have our cut line, we have our center back line, we have our seam allowance. We can also do our fold line for our dart. And you can even create these slashes. You can take your ruler and create these sort of indications right here, and those are helpful to make sure that you're matching the dart at the right angle, so that way if one is up and one is down, then you know that there's something not aligning properly. And you can also add this right here. So for the most part, it looks like I've got all the markings that I need to go forward and cut. Again, we're not using this top portion, so we're just gonna cut. And then we're gonna place on our mannequin to see how we did with our back bodice. So first let me go in here and cut. And if you do make a mistake and you forget to add the seam allowance to the center back, or the seam allowance anywhere, at least for the tissue fitting portion, you can always glue it. So you can always just take that 5/8 and just add it with some, I used glue stick because it's always easy and it's not so messy, or even tape. All right, I'm gonna fold it here. Let me first remove this. It's not. You always want to keep a clean workstation. Well, at least I do. I mean, it's, you know, sometimes as an artist, you're a little bit like all over the place. So it's not so easy, but it's definitely helpful to keep your workstation as clean as possible. I don't know about you guys, but it's difficult for me to work in chaos. So I kind of find myself like constantly cleaning and then going back and cleaning, and, you know, before I can move on to something else, just for that peace of mind that I'm working in a clean working space and sort of like clutter-free area, clutter-free brain for me. So as you can see that these lined up quite nicely. So it looks like we're doing pretty good. You won't really know until you actually put it on the a mannequin or a person. You always think you're doing a great job, and then you go to put it on a person and you're like, oh no. So, but it's definitely encouraging when you see those lines start to match up. So now we're gonna move it over to our mannequin and let's see what it looks like. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.